He's the one who won the Battle of Antioch. He was finally accepted as the Prince of Antioch, and he founded the Principality of Antioch up there. And then after Count Raymond IV of Toulouse successfully besieged and captured Tripoli in 1102, he established the County of Tripoli up there. Now, but when he died 3 years later in 1105, he left only an infant son as an heir. The County of Tripoli became a vassal of Jerusalem. In a very short period of time also, the Kingdom of Jerusalem encompassed all of these territories. Because when Baldwin of Boulogne became Baldwin of Boulogne, after he started at County of Edessa, he became King Baldwin of Jerusalem when Godfrey died a year later. And Edessa was made a fief of Jerusalem. Bohemon's Principality of Antioch only lasted until about 1119. It too was folded into the Jerusalem. And as I said, when Count Raymond's infant son wasn't able to come to the throne or become a ruler, the County of Tripoli became part of Jerusalem. So in a very short period of time, all these different counties and principalities became encompassed as the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, all this territory. So while back in Europe, this kingdom became known as Outremer, French for over the sea or overseas, O-U-T-R-E-M-E-R, Outremer. I must confess that when I first came across that word, I thought it was pronounced Outremer, but of course that's a French word, it's Outremer. It was established, the kingdom was established not as a European colony, as some of these old myths say, but as an independent entity to protect the Holy Land and guard the Christian pilgrimage routes from centuries of constant Muslim harassment. When Baldwin I died in 1118, another Baldwin came down from Edessa, a Baldwin of the Bourges, and he was crowned Baldwin II, and he reigned for 13 years. Meanwhile, Edessa itself was captured by the Islamic commander Imad al-Din Zangi in 1144. It was briefly retaken by Crusader forces 2 years later after Zangi died, and then again it was quickly recaptured by the Muslims. So it was back and forth, you got this seesaw effect here. This incident turned out to be one of the justifications for the Second Crusade. Also, with the creation of the Crusader kingdoms came the development of the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers. After a terrible massacre of Christian pilgrims by Muslim raiders on Easter 1119, a group of knights swore to help protect the kingdom and the pilgrims. Baldwin II allowed them to occupy a wing of the palace in Jerusalem, which was known as the House of Solomon. Supposedly it was the site of Solomon's temple. In 1126, the group's leader traveled to Europe for recruits, and he met the respected theologian and head of the Cistercian order, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard had been born into a noble family, and he trained as a knight in his youth before he became a monk. So he liked the idea of a holy military order, and he agreed to write the rules for the Templars. In 1128, a church council legitimized the order's existence, and its official name became the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, hence the Knights Templars. The Hospitallers grew out of the need to protect a string of hospitals that had been set up along the pilgrimage routes into the Holy Land. Eventually, this system of hospitals became known as the Hospital of St. John, and the Knights Order as the Order of St. John, or simply the Knights Hospitallers. Both the Templars and the Hospitallers would be heavily involved in practically all of the major Crusader battles in the future. Second Crusade, 1147 to 49. When the news of the fall of Edessa reached the West in 1145, the people of Europe realized that things weren't quite going so well in Outremer after all. Pope Eugene III issued a bull proclaiming a new crusade, the second, to help recapture Edessa. He also invited Bernard of Clairvaux to help, and in the words of one of the books I consulted, quote, "When the most powerful, persuasive, and revered man in Europe began to preach a second crusade, things began to happen," unquote. The Second Crusade was dominated by two kings, Louis VII of France, who had long desired to go on pilgrimage, and Conrad III of Germany, who had campaigned in the Holy Land earlier. Both rulers were easily gathered more knights and crusading families to the cause. In fact, it was a cause which was rapidly becoming a tradition, family tradition handed down from one generation to generation in many of these families. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism also reared its ugly head again in the same German cities as it has been during the First Crusade. But this time, when Bernard learned of the massacres that would start it up again, he hurried to the Rhine Valley and ordered the killings to stop. And they did, immediately. Imagine the power this man had. Conrad departed in May 1147, followed by Louis and his troops a month later. They both followed the same route down to Constantinople, where they met the current emperor, Manuel Comnenus, who was not pleased to see them. They soon learned that Manuel had just signed a 20-year peace treaty with the Seljuk Sultan of Konya, which was the renamed city of Iconium, and thus they quickly learned to distrust the Byzantines again. Conrad's impatience with the French unfortunately led to his downfall. Having crossed over to Asia Minor, he decided not to wait for Louis, and he was guided down to Dorylaeum by some Byzantine scouts. Should have known better. Anyways, short of food and water, the Germans stopped at the Bathys River near the city on October 25th. But just the night before, those Byzantine guides mysteriously disappeared. And when the troops dismounted to refresh themselves, they were ambushed and massacred by a strong Seljuk army. Conrad was wounded and he retreated his survivors back to Nicaea, where they were joined by the French. And when Conrad became ill, he returned all the way back to Constantinople to recuperate. Louis was now in command, and he moved the combined army to the port of Ephesus, which refused to sell them any kind of supplies. After employing the Templars to discipline his increasingly disgruntled troops, Louis completely routed a Turkish army that attacked them just outside of Ephesus. He next headed for the port of Adalia and met a ridiculously small Byzantine fleet that could only ferry a very small portion of his army down to Antioch. While he traveled by ship, the bulk of his army traveled overland, suffering terribly from the heat and lack of food and water. The situation was exacerbated by constant harassment of the Muslims, and only a tiny force actually reached Antioch. Louis then traveled on to Jerusalem to finally fulfill his pilgrimage vows, and he was surprised to meet Conrad, who was already down there. Conrad had recovered from his wounds, and he sailed down to Jerusalem to await Louis. Both these two kings now met with the king of Jerusalem, Baldwin III, and then they decided to attack Damascus. Their siege, though, was only a sort of a half-hearted affair, and it was eventually aborted. Having accomplished nothing very much of any value, they all headed home, ending the Second Crusade in 1149. Now, many important events occurred in the next 40 years between the Second and Third Crusades, and I'll give some of the highlights. Persistent Muslim attacks and raids convinced the Christian leaders that a series of fortifications were necessary to garrison the knights and protect the Christian pilgrims. So, by 1166, a line of 50 castles had been constructed up and down the kingdom. Some of them were really, truly massive castles too, like Carac, Crac de Montreal, and Crac de Chevalier. I don't think some of them, Montreal's down there. Chevalier's up here somewhere, I can't remember. They're not always on all these maps here. Latin states maps. Okay, we can pick up another one here. There we go. There's Montreal, there's Carac, and they still don't, here's Crac de Chevalier up there. Remainder of the county of Edessa finally fell to the Muslims in 1151. There's no more Edessa up there anymore here. We can see this. It also shows some of the major castles I just mentioned, I just pointed out. January 1153, going back a few years before this map, Baldwin III besieged the Egyptian held Ascalon, which finally capitulated in August. Then in 1162, at the age of 33, Baldwin III died, and he was succeeded to the throne by his brother Amalric. And while the Fatimids down in Egypt were experiencing dynastic troubles, Amalric took advantage of this confusion, and he led an army down to capture Alexandria and Cairo. And he won a handsome tribute in gold for his efforts. He besieged Alexandria 3 more times, and when some trouble with the Byzantines called him back home up in 1169, he signed a truce with a certain Islamic leader who was destined to play a rather prominent role in the Third Crusade. Salah ad-Din, better known to us Westerners as Saladin, was a young Kurd whose uncle was sent down to conquer Egypt in 1169 by the Fatimid ruler of Syria, Nur ad-Din. Saladin succeeded his uncle as vizier of Egypt, and he gradually gained his independence, uniting Egypt under the Abbasid Caliphate. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin became ruler both of Egypt and Syria, and after he married Nur ad-Din's widow. Amalric also died in 1174 and was succeeded to the throne by his 13-year-old son Baldwin IV, also known as the Leper King, because he had contracted leprosy as a child. His leprosy didn't seem to affect his military ability, though, because he won a battle against Saladin in 1177 at Montgisard. In 1187, though, was a rather pivotal year. In that year, Saladin, who had consolidated control over his Syrian holdings, built an army of about 30,000 troops and sent them down to attack the city of Tiberias, which was about, right out there, Tiberias, in an attempt to draw out the Christian forces. The city sent out messengers for help, and at first some Christian leaders down in Jerusalem advised against sending any help. Now, Baldwin IV had died 2 years earlier, and the new king, Guy, who really wasn't very much of a military leader, he overruled the council's decision, so the entire kingdom army marched out to relieve Tiberias. But their route took them through hot and arid terrain, and soon soldiers and horses were suffering terribly from the thirst. They turned back towards Hayton, up there, to get some water, but Saladin and his army blocked their way. Saladin's troops set fire to some dried brush that they had collected, and all the black smoke blew directly into the Christian army, blinding and choking them. The infantry broke formation to go look for water, leaving the cavalry behind. At first, Saladin's cavalry charged the knights, who then charged right back, but soon all Crusader organization was lost, and the Muslims killed thousands of the Crusader soldiers here. The very few survivors were taken to Saladin's tent, where the Templars and the Hospitallers were gleefully beheaded by the Muslim religious leaders there, as Saladin looked on approvingly. King Guy, though, was spared for ransom. Here's another look. Another map about the same thing from one of my books here. On both that previous map and this one, you can get an idea of the reduced size of the Crusader kingdoms now. They're not so quite far out here. They're much closer to the coast. Just before the Battle of Hattin in 1187, with the major army of Outremer eliminated at Hattin, or Hayton, again, I'm not sure how to pronounce a lot of these names here, Saladin was free to overrun a large portion of the rest of the Crusader kingdoms, leaving only Tyre, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem at first untouched, but later he decided to attack Jerusalem. Now, Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem has been falsely compared with the Crusaders' attack in 1199 as a shining example of Saladin's chivalry. But again, the detractors conveniently ignored the rules of war during that time. In late September, Saladin's army surrounded Jerusalem. Several attacks were made and courageously beaten back, but a breach was finally made in the walls by the Muslims. Now, there were some hotheads in the city who wanted to charge out in a blaze of glory, but others decided to ask for surrender terms and to protect the women and children. So Saladin allowed them to ransom part of the population for gold, while those who couldn't pay were sold into the slave markets. Even the 18th century writer Edward Gibbon, who was not a friend of Christianity, recognized the difference in the two outcomes here. Quote, "Of some writers, it is a favorite and invidious theme to compare the humanity of Saladin with the massacre of the First Crusade. But we should not forget that the Christians offered to capitulate, and that the Mohammedans of Jerusalem sustained the last extremities of an assault and storm." Unquote. There you have it, folks. If a city surrendered before the attackers stormed the walls, it was spared. The Muslim defenders during the First Crusade refused to surrender, and thus they were massacred. Those were the unwritten rules of war for that time. Now, at this point, another player enters the stage. Conrad of Montferrat sailed down to Tyre from Constantinople after he learned about Saladin's latest maneuvers. Conrad's father had already been in the Holy Land since about 1183. Saladin was on his way to besiege Tyre, and Conrad convinced the city leaders there to defend themselves instead of surrendering. With Conrad in command, the defense was stout, and that made Saladin go looking for an easier target. But Saladin returned back again in November, this time bringing a newly built navy with him. In a surprise dawn attack, the Tyre navy bested Saladin's Egyptian fleet, and they either captured them outright or ran them aground. At the same time, Saladin's troops attacked the city in a sort of a coordinated manner, but Conrad's forces charged out of the city and completely routed the Saracen army. With this stunning victory, Conrad was now an instant celebrity, and he used his influence to send a group of emissaries to Europe to preach another crusade. And with the knowledge of Saladin's capture of Jerusalem and the defeat of the Crusader army at Hattin as further justification, both King Henry II of England and King Philip II of France were convinced to take the cross. The new Pope, Clement III, also convinced the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, to take the cross. Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Henry and Philip were trying to settle some territorial disputes, and before they could do that, Henry died, and he left the throne to his son, Richard the Lionheart, Coeur de Lion, who continued his father's negotiations for a short time. Frederick Barbarossa refused to wait for these other two kings. For some reason, all these German kings are impatient, I guess. So he set out with a sizable army of his own, thus starting the Third Crusade. Now, one of my sources says he moved out in May 1189. Another says he didn't start out until 1190. Either way, I guess it depends on who you want to read here. Either way, modern estimates peg his army size at a reasonable about 3,000 knights, maybe 5 to 6 times as much infantry, making about a 20,000 man force, which is a pretty good sized force for that period. Meanwhile, in yet another example of Byzantine treachery, the Emperor Isaac I had agreed to sign a mutual defense pact with Saladin earlier in 1189, in which both sides pledged to fight against any Western army attempting to reach Palestine and Jerusalem. So while Frederick was able to move his army through both Hungary and Serbia without incident, he was harassed by irregular forces when he entered Byzantine territory. At Philippopolis, Frederick simply brushed aside the main Byzantine army. Then he captured Adrianople, and he briefly toyed with the idea of besieging Constantinople. But Isaac surrendered and agreed to provide free passage and supplies. All right. Roots of the Third Crusade. Here, this map here shows the routes that the three kings followed. Frederick up here, Richard here, Philip down there. We can see Frederick's route to the north. He went through north and through Asia Minor. After he crossed Asia Minor, Frederick captured the fortress city of Konya from the Saracens and continued moving south. Unfortunately, again, Frederick never made it to the Holy Land because while moving through Cilicia, he started to cross the river and he fell off his horse and drowned. Now, his army was devastated by his death, even though his son, the Duke of Swabia, also named Frederick, took over command. The majority of the army still decided to turn back home in despair. The young Duke Frederick then led the remainder of the army to Antioch 10 days later. And after all the desertions, his force had been reduced down to 5,000 men, which included about 300 knights. In the meantime, Richard and Philip settled their affairs and raised the funds to pay for their trips. They both decided on the water route to the Holy Land this time, instead of the land route, so Philip sailed from Sicily at the end of March 1191. As I said, here's the water route here, and reached the port city and fortress of Acre in April after first stopping up at Tyre. Richard left soon after Philip, and he reached Acre in June after an unplanned side trip to Cyprus. A storm at sea had blown some of Richard's ships towards Cyprus, and after the Byzantine governor there had taken his crews hostage, Richard overran and captured the island. Now with Cyprus in their hands, the Crusaders had a staging area from which they could issue supplies to the Crusader kingdoms. All right, a little bit more here too. Hold still. Okay. Now, why did the kings head for Acre? Here we have a whole bunch of forces here from Philip's here. Richard is up here and Cyrus coming down here. You got Acre, Tyre and Acre is about over here. They're pretty much overwhelmed by all the counters I put there. All at the same time the kings were gathering their forces together back in 1189, King Guy of Jerusalem, who had been set free by Saladin, he decided to besiege Acre, and he had been engaged in that operation since 1189. By early January 1190, a year before Richard and Philip even set sail, a large Christian fleet had reinforced Guy's army and with troops from northwestern Europe, and the fleet was now firmly anchored and beached around Acre and its Saracen defenders. Of course, Saladin couldn't let this threat go unanswered, so he brought up his army to surround the Christian besiegers. And we have now a rather interesting situation. This created a unique situation in which the Saracens are besieging, the Saracens are up here, besieging the Crusaders there, which are now besieging a Muslim-controlled Acre. So the Crusaders are sandwiched in the between here. Now this map shows the situation just before the first battle in October 1189, October 4th through 1189. There were quite a few battles. I don't have time here today to go into details here, but occasional assaults on the city and attacks by Saladin's forces were a quite regular occurrence during those 2 years before the other Crusaders arrived. Sometimes these attacks were half-hearted because the Saracen had light cavalry. They didn't have much heavy cavalry like the Crusaders did. Their light cavalry just didn't like to attack the solid lines of Crusader heavy infantry and crossbowmen. It didn't turn out good for them. At the same time, the city defenders there managed to destroy several Crusader siege towers and other siege engines that they built to assault the walls. So that by the time Philip and Richard finally arrived in 1191, this siege was well underway and had been going on for about 2 years already, about 3 years already here. For a long time, neither side held an advantage over the other, and this resulted in a rather frustrating stalemate. And some of my books here telling about some of these have several chapters on the siege of Acre here. So finally, towards the end, though, here's Acre again, down there. Crusaders, and you got the Saracens around them. The Crusaders managed to build a fosse, or what we would call a ditch on there to discourage the Saracen infantry, or I'm sorry, the Saracen cavalry here. Eventually, though, after receiving some reinforcements from the Genoese fleet, the Crusaders made one more determined assault on the increasingly demoralized Acre garrison, which is shown on here. And the city was surrendered without Saladin's permission on July 11th, 1191. And in one of his rare moments of rashness, Richard still had all 5,000 inhabitants of the city killed. Saladin's navy down here, which had been bottled up in the harbor by the Christian fleet, was also surrendered. Now with Acre in Christian hands, Philip decided to return home, leaving Richard in charge of the Crusaders. Richard reorganized the army, and he started marching south along the coast in August. The army was now composed of something like 4,000 knights, 14,000 infantry, of which a considerable number were powerful crossbowmen, and about 2,000 Turcopole light infantry skirmishers. They moved at a rather slow, leisurely pace only during the cool of the morning. They camped where water was readily available and were constantly resupplied by a Christian fleet following offshore. Saladin's army paralleled the Crusaders further inland while marching down right with them. But his constant hit-and-run tactics failed to goad the Christians into a rash charge because Richard kept strict discipline. Meanwhile, when the armies reached town of Arsuf, down here, and its surrounding forest, Saladin reluctantly decided to attack. With the shoreline to their back, the heavy cavalry, Crusaders are down here, the Saracens are up here. Heavy cavalry was shielded by a wall of heavy infantry further inland, which was covered by bowmen who fired on the advancing Saracen light cavalry again. The rest of the Christian force was rigidly kept in check by Richard, despite several Saracen assaults. But when the Templar force in the lead impetuously charged the Saracens, Richard quickly rode out ahead of them, releasing the rest of the Crusader cavalry as well, and slammed headlong into Saladin's force. After suffering terrible losses, at least from at least 2 more nightly charges, the Saracen army routed away. Saladin made one more attempt to recapture Jaffa a year later, but his army was defeated by a ridiculously small force of only 50 knights and several hundred crossbowmen commanded by Richard. The Third Crusade finally ended with 2 leaders making a treaty that allowed unmolested access to Jerusalem by unarmed pilgrims. How long this treaty would have lasted is anyone's guess, because Saladin died the next year, and about 6 years after that, Richard died in battle in France. And since Jerusalem was still in Crusade Muslim hands, Pope Innocent III called for another crusade, number 4. We're through here now. Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204. At first, the Pope's call was ignored, but he recruited another high-powered cleric, Fulk of Neuilly, to preach the crusade, and during a tournament in 1199, Count Thibault of Champagne took the cross and spread his enthusiasm amongst their relatives and friends. This time they decided that since most I get my Crusaders and Saracens mixed up here. Despite the fact that since most previous Saracen armies had originated in Egypt, they were going to attack the source of their trouble this time, and they were going to eliminate the Egyptian power once and for all. Then they could concentrate on liberating Jerusalem at their leisure and the rest of the Holy Land. Thus they start making plans to attack and sail for Egypt. The city of Venice was approached and agreed to build a crusader fleet that would cost 91,000 marks. This was to transport 4,500 knights and their horses, 9,000 squires, 21,000 infantry, food for 9 months, and about 50 fighting galleys as escorts. The fleet was ready by June 1202, but the Crusaders had been unable to recruit and collect all the men necessary, the money that they expected to give, so they were still owed something like 31,000 marks to the Venetians. A solution, though, was offered by the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo. He suggested that his Venetians accompany the Crusaders, and along the way they would attack and conquer the city of Zara on the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea. Zara had recently rebelled against Venetian rule, and Dandolo obviously wanted it back. The fleet set sail in early October 1202, and immediately attacked Zara, which surrendered to the Venetians in November, and they then sailed down to Corfu for the winter. Here's where things went terribly wrong. They met an exiled Byzantine prince, Alexius, different Alexius from the earlier one, obviously, whose father, Isaac II, had recently been deposed, and he offered to pay them 200,000 silver marks, plus provide provisions and Byzantine reinforcements for their expedition if they helped him to regain the throne. Of course, they would have profited immensely by such a deal, both financially, of course, to pay off their debt, and also in their efforts to secure and attack the Holy Land. So they agreed to support him. The next year, July 1203, they landed at Constantinople and prepared to besiege the city. And there's Constantinople again. By that time, the Greek navy had become just as decrepit as the Greek army had been back in Romanus' time, and the Venetians quickly sunk the remaining rotting galleys. On July 17th, a coordinated siege began from both the sea and the land, with the walls being quickly scaled and the gates forced open. At one point, a Greek army marched out to menace the Crusader force, but soon retreated back in again without any trying to fight. The emperor escaped the city during the night, and the Byzantines opened the gates to the Crusaders in the morning, and they accepted young Alexius as their new emperor, Alexius IV. Now, at first, Alexius tried to pay off his promised debt, but there wasn't enough money in the treasury, so he started to tax the nobility, who, of course, became sort of resentful over this here. Tensions grew worse because the Byzantines hated the Latins, as the Crusaders were called by the Byzantines, and Alexius ceased paying the debt all entirely so as to try to calm the unrest. That didn't help any. A palace coup killed Alexius and then put someone else on the throne. In order to acquire the money that they'd been promised, the Crusaders decided to attack the city a second time and loot it for the immense wealth of its inhabitants. In April 1204, 2 assaults were made at the sea walls by the Venetian fleet, the second being successful, and they opened the city gates to the mounted knights who were waiting outside. 3 days were spent looting the city, and Baldwin of Flanders was placed on the throne. By now, of course, all thoughts of attacking Egypt had are long gone, totally discarded, forgotten, Crusaders agreed to occupy the city and to defend Baldwin's rule until 1205. When that deadline arrived, the remaining Crusaders left, and what little remained of the Byzantine Empire, if you could call it that, continued to disintegrate. The last Western emperor there remained on the throne until 1261. To say the least, Innocent III was extremely displeased when he learned of the sack of Constantinople, and he stubbornly called for a fifth crusade in 1213 because Jerusalem still hadn't been liberated yet. Now, if I could bring this back up again one more time, just to show one little item. Oops, wrong one. Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221. After Innocent died in 1216, his replacement, Honorius III, convinced Duke Leopold VI of Austria and King Andrew II of Hungary to lead armies against the Muslims. They sailed in August 1217, stopped first at Acre, where they were reinforced by the knightly orders and Cyprian troops of King Hugh I. King Andrew, suffering from illness, returned home in January 1218 with his troops, and the remaining army waited until April to receive some more reinforcements. They then sailed in May to the heavily fortified city of Damietta at the mouth of the Nile. Damietta is down here, and I mentioned Alexandria before. Alexandria is over there. Cairo is down this way here. So Damietta is over that way. Camp was set up on the riverbank opposite from the city, and in August they captured a fortified island in the middle of the river. A massive chain extended from that island across the river to Damietta to block ships from using the river. The Crusaders cut the chain, and they waited for more reinforcements. They didn't move very speedily here. Along with the reinforcements that arrived at the end of September was a papal representative named Cardinal Pelagius, no relation to the earlier Pelagius, obviously, who, despite his complete lack of military training, took control of the army. In October, the Muslim army attacked the Crusaders several times, and they were repelled. Then in February 1219, the Crusaders were finally ready to attack Damietta again, but the Egyptian Sultan, Al-Kamil, became worried over the results of the siege, and he wanted to negotiate a settlement. He offered to surrender the city of Jerusalem and sign a 30-year truce. Wow! But Pelagius foolishly rejected his generous offer. Al-Kamil then sweetened the deal by offering to pay an additional 30,000 byzants. But still, Pelagius turned it down despite the Crusader leaders' willingness to accept. Pelagius then foolishly ordered 4 different attacks on Damietta in July, all of which failed. In August, the Muslims ambushed the Crusaders in a bloody defeat. But despite their heavy losses, the Crusaders still remained as a formidable force. Then, as the Egyptians again tried to negotiate a treaty with the Crusader leaders, some sentries noticed that Damietta seemed to be very quiet and still. Troops were quickly summoned, and the Crusaders easily entered and gained control of the abandoned city. Muslims had run out. One of the early groups of reinforcements was led by King John of Palestine, but he eventually left in disgust in the spring of 1220 due to Pelagius' bombastic actions. Others left for similar reasons, but again, other replacements arrived soon after, so it was a little bit of come and go here. And Pelagius decided to attack south up the Nile toward the new fortifications at El Mansoura, which they don't have on this map here. So I don't know if it's below Cairo or above Cairo. Anyway, once again, Pelagius had them build a camp on the opposite side, on the opposite bank from El Mansoura, despite warnings from the experienced commanders that this wasn't a very good time of year for doing that. This was the inundation season when the Nile overflowed its banks. The Muslims bypassed the Crusader camp, and they sent some ships to the mouth of the Nile to cut off supplies coming up from Damietta. They also destroyed several dikes, which allowed the Nile to flood the Crusader camp. Too late, Pelagius realized their predicament, and instead of any more fighting, he agreed to sign an 8-year armistice and peace settlement at the end of August 1221. The remaining Crusaders evacuated Egypt for home without gaining any access to Jerusalem or the rest of the Holy Land. What the inept Pelagius had been unable to accomplish, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a rather thorough scoundrel of a man, was able to successfully negotiate. The Sixth Crusade from 1228 to 1229 is unique because it turned out to be a rather diplomatic crusade. Arriving at Acre in 1229 in performance of his penance for his many sins, Frederick II was under the ban of excommunication at the time because he had made too many excuses not to go on crusade after vows that he had made many years earlier. He was accompanied by a rather small band of followers that was nowhere large enough or strong enough to do any kind of serious military campaigning. Al-Kamil was still the Egyptian sultan, but he was at the time up north attacking Damascus when Frederick arrived. And he was afraid he'd have to fight on two fronts now, against the new Crusaders and against Damascus. Therefore, he was more than willing to negotiate a treaty with Frederick to return Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control without any bloodshed whatever. But Frederick also foolishly agreed to leave Jerusalem defenseless and allow the Muslims complete access. Now, this state of affairs actually lasted, I understand, for something like 15 years before it broke down in August of 1244 when another group of Turkish nomads, the Khwarezmians, attacked and captured Jerusalem, killing many Christians and burning several churches. The Khwarezmians then moved south to join forces with the Egyptians. After gathering what Christian forces and knightly orders were still available in the Holy Land, the kingdom leaders marched out and met the large Muslim army down at Gaza, and they were totally defeated. Crusade number 7, from 1248 to 1254, was led by the French king, Louis IX, also known as Louis the Pious. He had long desired to go on crusade, but was delayed by severe illness. After his recovery, he began to meticulously plan his expedition as early as October 1245, and he convinced a group of French nobles to accompany him. Like other recent crusades, the goal again was Egypt, and he and his men finally sailed for Cyprus in September 1248, where they spent the winter. Again, Cyprus up there again here. The Khwarezmians, which I just mentioned, were raiding up and down Palestine at the time, so Louis sent about 500 knights to help Bohemond V, the Prince of Antioch. By May 1249, Louis and his troops landed at the beach near Damietta in Egypt. One estimate of his force included, quote, 2,500 to 2,800 knights, 5,000 crossbowmen, and about 15,000 other combatants, unquote. They were immediately attacked by Egyptian cavalry, which was unable to make a dent against the solid French infantry. Instead, the Egyptians suffered losses and they retreated, taking the city inhabitants with them and again abandoning the city completely. Now, Louis had planned to take all summer long besieging Damietta and then move up the Nile in the fall after, of course, the river's annual inundation had passed. So this quick and unexpected victory upset his timetable rather considerably. He decided to stay put in camp for the summer, but some of the people in his army didn't want to wait that long, and they went back home. Likewise, disease inevitably stalked its way through the camp, killing many. Near the end of November, Louis marched upstream to attack the fortress at Al-Mansur again, just like the Fifth Crusaders had done. A ford across the river was discovered with the help of a local native, but it took a while for the men to cross over. Unwilling. People have to be either people are impatient in doing things or they're too slow. But anyways, unwilling to wait for the rest of the army, the advance guard charged into Al-Mansura, where they were quickly outnumbered and promptly slaughtered by the city garrison. But when the rest of the army arrived, the city was attacked and overwhelmed, and the Muslims were kicked out. So, go figure. Louis then attempted to negotiate a deal with the Egyptian leaders to trade Crusader-occupied Damietta for the Holy Land. But unbeknownst to him and the other Crusaders, Muslim forces down at the mouth of the Nile were again able to block supplies from reaching Louis' army up the river, and they began to suffer. Realizing their poor condition, the army began an unorganized, straggling march back to Damietta, but they were intercepted by Muslim soldiers along the way, who gave them the choice of death or conversion to Islam. Louis himself was captured, later ransomed by the Templars. After regaining his freedom, he then spent another 4 years in the Holy Land rebuilding Acre and Jaffa, leaving a garrison of knights and infantry at Acre. One of the Muslim leaders Louis had fought against in Egypt was a thoroughly despicable man known as Baybars. Not an Arab or Egyptian, African, Turk, or Kurd, Baybars was a Mamluk, and he seized the throne in 1260 when the Egyptian Sultan was assassinated. Mamelukes were not an ethnic group. They were slaves. Mameluk is an Arabic word meaning to be owned. And the Mamelukes were originally children who had been either kidnapped or sold, coming mainly from the Caucasus region up in Asia. They were raised and intensely trained as warriors and fanatical Muslims. Over the years, they gained considerable power and eventually destroyed the remainder of Saladin's old dynasty down in Egypt. After consolidating power, Baybars literally went rampaging up through the Holy Land throughout the decade of the 1260s, attacking and sacking cities and besieging Crusader fortresses. He was an extremely ruthless, merciless, and bloodthirsty opponent who did not abide by the rules of warfare that I explained earlier. Many times while besieging the city or fort, he would offer surrender terms, allowing the inhabitants to go free. Yet when they agreed to surrender and opened the gates to his troops, Baybars immediately broke his word and he allowed his men to slaughter the inhabitants. This happened so often that it became his standard operating procedure, and his deceptive practices became very well known across the region. Whenever he attacked a city or fortress, the people realized that they would have to fight to the death to protect their homes because they knew they'd receive no mercy from Baybars. Antioch was the last city to fall to Baybars, and that reduced the Christian kingdoms to a thin coastal strip composed of Acre, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Alexandretta. Louis and the rest of Europe eventually learned of Baybars' depredations in the Holy Land, and he wished to return and reconquer Jerusalem. Pope Clement IV gave his approval in 1267, and Louis's 3 sons and 2 brothers agreed to follow him on his second crusade. At first, 2 other kings agreed to take the cross as well, King Henry III of England and James I of Aragon, but problems arose despite all of Louis's careful planning. Egypt remained the target again, and with the help of a Genoese fleet, Louis sailed from southern Sardinia in late June or early July of 1270 on what became known as the Eighth Crusade. Unfortunately, he lost the help of the other 2 kings because the Aragonese fleet was too damaged in a storm to continue, and they had to return home, while Henry III decided not to go at the last minute. Instead, he sent his son, Edward. This move delayed the English until August. Once again, Louis's army sailed alone, but rather than sailing to the Holy Land or to Egypt, the fleet sailed almost directly south and made landfall down at Tunis in mid-July. They secured a camp in a fortress built on the site of Carthage, and he waited for the other fleets to arrive, unaware that at least one of them wasn't coming at all. Once again, the intense summer heat took all toll on the troops, as it had so many times in the past, and disease again passed through the camp. This time, Louis succumbed to illness, and he died on August 25th, 1270. Historians disagree over the number of crusades to count, with some only counting 6 or maybe 7, while others are counting up to 9 like I am today. The 8th Crusade ended with Louis's death, but it morphed, you might say it morphed into the 9th Crusade when Prince Edward finally arrived down from England, and he was distressed to find the French forces preparing to return back home, though nothing had been accomplished. He knew his small force couldn't attack Egypt successfully, so he sailed on to Acre in May of 1271 with a contingent of 300 knights and maybe about 600 infantry. This additional force was just enough to considerably strengthen the city garrison there, and he used this as leverage to sign a 10-year peace treaty with Baybars. Edward returned home to become Edward I upon the death of his father, and Baybars finally died on July 1st, 1277. Now, even after this last official crusade, the kingdoms continued to exist for a little while longer, though the court of the Kingdom of Jerusalem actually had to move to Cyprus. Baybars had already successfully captured Antioch back in 1268 before the 8th Crusade, and later Acre was taken itself by the Muslim forces in 1291. The remainder of the cities of Outremer fell soon after, and there were no more crusades. There was one brief flicker of the Crusader flame, though, in the latter decades of the 13th century. The Mongol ruler of Persia, of all people, made several attempts to approach the kings of Europe and the Pope with an offer to ally his Mongol forces with theirs against the Muslims and to recapture Jerusalem. At first, they all seemed rather enthusiastic, but they just couldn't agree to a date. And of course, they all had more pressing problems at home, too, as well, so nothing was actually planned. By the time the Mongol ambassadors returned home and discussed, their leader was dead. Here's another tantalizing what if from history, folks, to speculate on how successful a 10th crusade would have been if the kings of Europe had allied with the Mongols against the Muslims. Interesting. So what did the Crusades accomplish? Admittedly, no. They did not permanently save Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Islamic control. But it turns out that they did something far more important. They kept the scourge of Islam out of Europe for several centuries, while allowing the European nations to flourish culturally, technologically, spiritually, and militarily during that same time. In the words of one author, quote, "They bought Europe time that might have meant the difference between her demise and demitude and her rise and return to glory," unquote. While the Crusaders were busy attacking the Middle East, the Muslims weren't attacking Europe, because they were instead concentrating on defending their own conquered lands. They didn't attempt to resume the jihad until after the Crusades ended, and by then the European kingdoms were ready to fight back. In addition, successful jihad would have practically wiped out Western Christian civilization and replaced it with repressive Sharia law, and reduced Christians to humiliating dhimmi status. The scientific discoveries and technological innovation that has marked the past few centuries are the result of the Christian belief in a God who created everything with order, thus allowing man to discover the laws of nature and use them for God's glory and man's needs. But Muhammad's Allah of the Quran is completely different. To quote again, Christians believed in a coherent and consistent universe governed by a good God. Muslims believed in a universe governed by a God whose will was so absolute as to preclude coherence and consistency. In Islam, Allah is absolutely free. Al-Ghazali, a Muslim philosopher, and others took issue with the very idea that there were laws of nature. They would be blasphemy, a denial of Allah's freedom. To say that he created the universe according to consistent rational laws, or that he cannot do something, would be to bind his absolute sovereignty. His will controls all, but it is inscrutable. Thus, modern science developed in Christian Europe rather than in the House of Islam. In the Islamic world, Allah killed science, unquote. In other words, Allah, Muhammad's Allah, is a God of chaos, able to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, therefore making it pretty much impossible, or at least extremely hard, for anyone to act as a scientist and attempt to learn anything lasting about our world. This philosophy would have stifled science and learning for centuries, and it is just one of many consequences of potential Islamic rule which the Crusades gratefully saved Europe from. Another consequence of the Crusades was economic. As the Crusader kingdoms struggled to exist, they built a trade system with local Muslim merchants, purchasing Middle Eastern and Far Eastern foods, spices, perfumes, textiles like silk, other luxury goods, many of which they introduced to their friends and relatives back home in Europe. This created a great demand for these exotic goods in Europe, and the trade cities like Genoa, Venice, Milan, Florence, and others flourished. Constantinople also grew wealthy as it became a great trading hub between East and West. But when Constantinople was finally captured by the Sultan Mehmed II in 1453, that closed one of the most important doors to the Far East. Europe was now forced to find alternate routes to Cathay, as China, of course, was called. So while the Portuguese and others were sailing around Africa, Columbus tried to find a western sea route to Asia. Oops. Turns out he and later explorers stumbled upon a newer world instead. And we all, of course, know what came of that. Now, I really don't think it's too much of a stretch to argue maybe that the Crusades and their aftermath eventually led to the birth of the United States of America. Am I going too far off in left field by saying, I don't know. Anyway, after all, God is in control of history, and I do not say that flippantly. Scripture reminds us repeatedly that God is sovereign and that all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. And he is more than able to use feeble human efforts to bring about his will in history, even though those involved may not fully understand the implications of their actions. God used the Crusades for his own purposes, and now we can look back and see what those purposes were, and that's why I defend the Crusades. And if anybody's interested also, where I got most of my information, the information from, I got some 2 books here. Islam, Politically Correct Guide to Islam and the Crusades, 2 different copies of the same book, different covers. God's Battalions, they wrote excellent here, and another one here about the Crusades dealing from the just before the Third Crusade to the end of the Ninth here. So 3 little excellent books here. There's obviously more available too as well here. So, and I don't know if anybody has any kind of questions at all or anything, or not that I consider myself to be an expert on the subject, but no questions. Okay. Well, let's end with prayer then here. Our gracious Heavenly Father, you are our rock. You are our solid fortress, and who defends us from the pit of our adversaries here. We ask that you would stretch forth your strong right arm and put to flight those who would attack and disparage your holy church, your holy beloved church. That you would be our shield and our defender and our buckler in the daily fight against both of our individual sins and the temptations of the world and the arrows of the devil against us continually every day. We ask that Christ gives us the victory in all things, because we know, of course, that we have no power without him. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.